Well, hello and welcome everyone to another American TESOL Institute webinar. I'm your host, Jason R. Levine, also known as Fluency MC. And this is an interesting one because we are going to introduce, me, American TESOL Institute, methods and approaches to teaching English that have been important, prominent from sort of the beginning until now. Now, can we do that in a short webinar? Yes, we can if we introduce them in a kind of very introductory way, introduce them, right? Not superficially, however. So I'm going to attempt to go through them rather quickly, yet I hope make it meaningful for you. It motivates you, perhaps even inspire you to dig deeper into these methods and approaches to teaching English. So here we go. We're going to be looking at how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Notice methods, approaches. The language of it kind of changes, and that's very telling. We begin with this idea of a method, and we see that word later on, but it's not really fair. Well, I'll explain. But the idea, I guess, right, that, there's one way to do it. Here it is, boom. Grammar translation method, the direct method, the audiolingual method, and then we get more into approaches, communicative language teaching, also known as the communicative approach, the natural approach, task-based language teaching, content-based methods. There are a few I'm going to put together since we don't have that much time. I shouldn't keep saying we don't have time. The whole point of what we're doing is that we're just getting into it, and to make that, as I said, as meaningful as possible. The lexical approach, a personal favorite at the end there. Basically, these are chronological, grammar translation being early, 19th century, not early, right? And then we have the direct method that was also, that was late 19th century into the 20th century. Communicative language teaching, audiolingual, 50s, 60s, right? Behaviorist approach. And then we have communicative language teaching in the 70s, natural approach and communicative language teaching, CLT, both kind of a reaction to audiolingual, which we'll talk about. Task-based, content-based, lexical approach, more introduced in the 90s and more recent. Are language teaching methods ever really replaced by newer ones? I just showed you a kind of list of the ones we're going to talk about. I don't think so, right? It's more that they, they build on each other and they develop, they evolve. Is it okay to mix and match, to kind of pick certain things from one approach? I don't like the word method. I have it here, but right, a method, an approach, and some from others. If that's normal, isn't it? I don't think when we're looking at skill building, whether it's language, music, dance, art, anything, right? If it's a skill, if it's building knowledge, we might decide a certain way works better than another, although there could also be debate. But certainly with skill building, we don't really think, okay, there's only one way to learn to play music. There's only one way to learn how to play a sport, right? So there, of course, there's not only one way to learn a language. Therefore, there's not one way to teach a language. What are the variables we should consider? What factors should we consider? Because if we agree that we either need to choose a method or probably mix methods, approaches, right? Taking certain things from this one and that one, what should we think about? Certainly, age, level, class size, syllabus, culture, needs, interests. There could be more things. This is the short list I came up with. So English teachers worldwide watching this now, if you don't have so much experience or you have a lot of experience, I think we can all probably agree that these and other factors are important to help us determine what approach we use, how we plan lessons and create activities. And is it okay to select things from different methods and approaches? Absolutely. probably the only way to do it well, right? It's kind of strange now to think about somebody teaching English or any other language. By the way, what we're going to be talking about from here on out applies to teaching any second or foreign language, but of course we are focusing on English. Shout out to the American TESOL Institute for making these webinars possible. So happy to be here. We're going to begin with grammar translation method. Now, to be fair, when this method started, when people started using it, why were they excited about it? Because it made a lot of sense at the time. The point was not communicating in another language. Okay, I made the mistake. In English, we're just going to think grammar translation method for English. So the point was not to communicate. If the point was to communicate, then grammar translation method would be really silly, right? The focus, teaching grammar rules, translating from what? The native language, the first language, into English. So whether the language was Spanish or Japanese or whatever it was. Now, this was not to build communicative skills because that wasn't the goal. So if we look at what was good about it, the idea was, okay, here are people who need to be able to read. So if we do a lot of translation, this will help them read. Now, it's a little bit naive, but remember, this is the 19th century. And writing skills. The idea was, okay, if you can build this, then later you could learn more in the language. So it's very practical in that sense. But here's the con. We say cons, but there's just one con. It's such a big con, such a big drawback. I put it in as just one, right? So if you want to communicate, if that's the goal, again, it wasn't so much the goal, and that's why it made sense at the time, then it's really not going to work so well for you. What came along next was a really huge revelation, which was not just, okay, if we want to communicate, we can't use grammar translations, but we should be thinking about how people learn their language, native languages, right? Oh, how do kids learn it, right? Aren't they like sponges? Don't they get a lot of input? They're relaxed, they're curious, engaged, they're not ashamed of making mistakes. They don't have the capacity yet to analyze language. Can we create situations for learners in a classroom that kind of mirror some of this? Now, they got some of it right, they got some of it wrong. So the idea was communication without translating things, without memorizing lists, right? And this, to this day, is good. So this was like, okay, grammar translation, that's not the idea. We need to use the native language in the classroom, the first language that we are trying to learn. And grammar should not be something we put under the microscope. It should be learned along the way. This sounds good, doesn't it? The problem with this was, if you imagine, again, it's more of a problem of time, and we're going to see later how the direct method influenced so much later, and people kind of figured this out. The problem with this was, okay, let's do it for communication, yet let's kind of make these very simple role plays with very limited vocabulary. I mean, this was early on. This was, late 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, right? So they were trying to think, okay, what vocabulary do students need? This was the first time it was about target language, right? So this is amazing. But what was that target language? Maybe kind of contrived dialogues and things, right? Everyday communication, but what were the contexts? Easy to criticize it now, right? And notice I'm criticizing it while we're talking about the pros. So this is a long time ago. Without the direct method, it's hard to imagine anything that came after it that focuses more on real communication. But as I mentioned, I'll go to the second one, really important. Vocabulary was kind of, let's just kind of make it very limited, and then they'll learn grammar along the way. That's nice, but is there enough input coming in? If there's not enough vocabulary and grammar, if it's just focusing on kind of superficially, that's not going to help. Plus, then if you're not thinking about error correction. If you're not worrying about accuracy, then are you really increasing fluency enough and acquisition of vocabulary? So this was sort of the problem here. Audiolingual came along to solve a couple of these problems, right? So audiolingual saw that it's not about translation, just like the direct method. It's about the target language, same as direct method. But what was the problem? Direct method with those kind of short role plays. And I apologize that I'm not giving more extensive examples of a lesson plan for the direct method, how what activities would occur in a classroom with the direct method. It's just because I want to make sure we go over enough of what these methods and approaches were all about, how they build on each other, how you as a teacher might want to explore them in more detail. And that's when, of course, you could look at examples of planning lessons with one of these methods or approach and activities that could be done. So I may mention an activity sort of here and there, or a lesson, but I'm not going to get so deeply into it. So audiolingual said, look, you're not doing enough to make sure students are using the language accurately, right? Direct method, you're trying to help them with exposing them to language dialogues. Okay, they do this dialogue. Are they really getting enough exposure? Are they getting enough repetition? Repetition drilling sound bad, but automaticity sounds good. Internalize language patterns and structures. This is every student's dream. The question is, how do we get there? Do we get there with a method like audiolingual, or is there another way to do it? Everybody wants this, no? That you internalize. So audiolingual was not about analyzing grammar, stopping to talk about grammar, similar to the direct method. What was different is accuracy was important. And how was that regulated? Well, here are the dialogues, here are the drills, follow them. Repeat, repeat, repeat. As a result, you'll remember these structures, and next time you go and speak, audiolingual, this is about speaking also, let me get back to that, you'll be able to remember and use these structures automatically. You won't be thinking about things. Audiolingual, grammar, translation, reading, and writing. The point here is, for everyday life communication, we need to help students, learners, whether they're in the military, which is where a lot of this was happening, or in everyday life. So this sounds great, right? Is it always fun to drill? Is it always interesting to repeat things? What if you're doing a lot of pattern practice with some structures you need, but you're not doing it meaningfully? Right? The whole point is just to sound correct, make no mistakes. If it's not creative, if you're not interested in it, then are you going to be motivated? So you could lose motivation and not focus so much on expressing yourself, more just on how accurately you use the language. Well, communicative language teaching came along, and the comparison between CLT, communicative language teaching, and audiolingual is really, really important to understand what happened, right? So to summarize sort of where we are, we had grammar translation, which was not communicative at all and wasn't designed to be. Direct method came along, and then audiolingual to say, hey, we need to think more about communication skills, especially speaking and listening, both direct method and audiolingual for this, right? But then what was the problem? Direct method kind of not so real with vocabulary and students' needs and interests. Audiolingual, who cares about students' needs and interests? Just practice these structures and patterns, you'll get them in your head, and then you can be more creative. Something I like, by the way, and we'll come back to. But communicative language teaching said, hey, if students aren't interested in those drills, those patterns, they're not going to do them. We can go right into what students need. I'm saying students, learners interchangeably here. What people need with their foreign language or second language. They need to go out there and use it. What are the functions of the language? How do they apologize, make requests, complain, meet people, make friends, right? So it's kind of obvious, isn't it? Communicative language teaching. This is why CLT is still, well, today, I say still, since then, the 70s, really the most widely used approach that we're going to talk about. Any drawbacks, any cons, we'll get to them, right? Especially as we consider what was good about audiolingual and what was bad. So think about that. And what communicative language teaching tried to do to make things more real, but how that didn't come with any problems. Who can argue with this? You teach the functional and social use of the language to communicate. Real life purposes. What do students need to do? Do you need to, get a hotel room? Do you need to make friends? So back to the direct method for a moment. That was the idea too, but direct method wasn't really looking at the needs and the interests of the students in the room, right? And although they introduced the idea of target language, communicative language teaching took it to the next level, right? So not just these few little words that you could use, right? But authentic content using what's really out there, right? So this was the first time realia was used. Let's think about not just a, role play situation, but, what really happens in real life and what language comes, so language corpora, what were people using, what collocations, which we'll get to with lexical approach. But this was really even first looking at, what vocabulary was used, what grammar structures were really important to achieve to accomplish these goals in communication and achieve what you need in using your second language to make it meaningful. So what could be bad about that? Well, believe it or not, right? It was more about production. And that's important because audiolingual audiolingual was about both, right? But it really was not about production in a creative sense, right? It wasn't about students like really thinking, what do I need to say? As a result, one problem with CLT was, right, not enough necessarily. Now, students were motivated, they were getting it, but to produce language, to be able to, use language, if you don't have enough exposure to it, enough input, you're not going to be able to do it. There was controlled practice. That was part of it, right? How do you use these structures? Now, audiolingual was only controlled practice. So what happened is communicative language teaching understandably said, look, this drilling, this very controlled use of grammar and vocabulary, this doesn't give our students freedom to really do what they need to do in a free way. Problem is, if you don't have enough controlled practice, what happens to your accuracy? I don't have that here, but if audiolingual is too much about being correct, even though communicative language teaching did do error correction, if you don't have, it's not just error correction, right? If you don't have enough exposure to the language, you're not going to be able to know what naturally is correct and what isn't. And keep all these things in mind when we talk in a bit about other approaches. Also, in a large group, it's great in a small group to get students' opinions, to have them practice functional language. Not as easy with a big group of students to do a lot of the things that communicative language teaching wanted to do. Let's look at audiolingual versus communicative for a moment. So, what was good about audiolingual? Lots of input, and then the repetition. But if it's not interesting, if it's not real, it doesn't mean much, right? This is how I learned French And it helped me in one sense. So, I mean, audiolingual definitely has some really important positive qualities. It helped me in the sense of accuracy in pronunciation, and to a certain extent, grammar. But because I wasn't motivated, I wasn't going for those drills. I wasn't listening to those conversations again and again. You're not going to repeat if it's not interesting. Communicative approach, really the opposite situation. More interesting, right? You know, what's your opinion about this? How would you say this? What would you do in this context, right? And here's the language to do it. But if you don't get enough exposure to it, if you just have it in a book, the teacher asks you to look at it, maybe you repeated it a little bit, then you're not going to have it here. You're not going to have that automaticity that audiolingual was going for. Sounds like maybe we should marry these approaches, right? We're going to get to that. Do you know this expression? Don't throw the out with the, well, don't throw the who? Baby. Maybe that's easier. Don't throw the baby out with the. Why does this idiom, it's more than an idiom, isn't it? It's more a proverb, an aphorism. What does this mean? This is very important, which is why I put this right in the middle of this webinar, right? Because I think we really need to consider what happened with audiolingual, which was, if we just forget direct method from audiolingual, really a response to grammar translation, which was so pervasive and a really great response. It needs to be focusing on speaking and listening. Students need to be able to internalize those structures and use them automatically. Great. So that happened. But what happened when communicative language teaching came along? They correctly said, hey, if you're repeating all these things, it's pattern practice, it's not interesting. Okay. But if you don't get enough exposure, right? If you do things that are interesting, so communicative language teaching, it's meaningful, right? What's the problem, however? If you don't get enough exposure to it, you're not going to be able to remember and use language. So this is what happened. We're going to come back to that again. Another approach came along. Are you familiar with Krashen and Lewis and the others, right? It's a natural approach. Very interesting, because the natural approach also kind of a response to audiolingual. Around the same time as the communicative approach, we're talking about the 70s, right? Natural approach. More 70s, late 70s anyway. Certain things here, we're kind of trying to build on or do things better than audiolingual, but also with communicative language teaching. So what happened here? One of the things the natural approach said was, hey, let's go back to direct method in a way. Let's go back to how we learn language naturally. Lots of exposure, although direct method didn't really do that. So it's more like, okay, direct method said, let's learn English like we learn, native speakers learn it, right? Let's learn it naturally. Let's not think about grammar, right? And here are these little situations. Natural approach said, forget the little situations, the dialogues. Let's make it more open. And let's make sure there's a lot of exposure to the language. I love this. And this is where communicative language teaching fails in a lot of ways. If the student doesn't get enough understandable English, comprehensible input, then what do they have to work with, right? What can they produce? So we can say, hey, what do you think about gun control? Well, they have a lot of opinions maybe in their first language. Are they ready? Do they have the vocabulary and the grammar to use quickly? Audiolingual would say, hey, the problem is they didn't do enough repetition. Communicative language teaching would say, but that would be boring. Let's just listen to their opinions. Natural approach would say, well, how can they produce things? How can they give their opinion? They haven't had enough input. So this sounds like maybe it's bringing the two approaches together, especially if it's trying to make you feel relaxed. Seems like a perfect situation. Trying to increase our understanding of the language, right? So then students will, the idea here, the pro kind of into the con, develop their communication strategies to speak. But will they? If they just get that input, if it's more about what they are understanding, if they want to speak, okay, we're not going to pressure them. If you're not helping them enough with production, right? Especially not helping them correct their pronunciation, correct mistakes they make, it's not going to work out either. Communicative language learning, which came out in the 70s, still widely used today. Task-based language teaching came a bit later in the 80s. Also very, very common today. You might see TBL, which is task-based learning, not language. TBLT, task-based language teaching. What was going on here? Taking what was good, what still is good about communicative language teaching, what do students need to do with the language? What are the functions of English that they need to perform? How do they use it socially? How do they communicate with people? Holding on to that, but saying, hey, you know what? It's still, even though CLT, communicative language teaching, is using authentic materials, realia, it's still not focused enough on achievable goals. What are the things that students need to do? Make it more practical. They're going to be more motivated, right? If it's a task that something they need to do for school, for their life. So it's kind of taking the idea of CLT, but to another level. And that's why they're integrated, like really integrated these days. And we'll get to that shortly. So what was good, right? If students have tasks that they need to achieve and they're practical, right? They'll be more motivated, right, to do this. It's seems like the best of everything. Plus, looking at, because this came out later, looking at error correction. When should we correct errors? Communicative language teaching was about correcting errors. When should we not? Natural approach. Maybe just let them do what they're doing in TBL without thinking so much about it. Any drawbacks to this? Very few. The biggest one is some teachers will say, hey, it's really hard to do because, and if we have a big group, if you're very skilled at it, and there are great teachers out there using task-based learning or task-based language teaching, if you have a lesson that you've planned really well or your organization is planned well and you can replicate it, that's great. But if you're really going to make it happen, it takes time to plan, implement, takes time to oversee how it's going. Some students might say, as they might with some of these other approaches, especially direct method, natural approach, where's the instruction on grammar? When do I learn present perfect? When am I going to focus on, how to make the TH sound? So it does have that idea of sort of implicitly learning, which personally I think is great, but more, some students, especially as students get older, might think, hey, we're doing this stuff, but I'm not getting enough, direct instruction on language. Well, you can focus on task-based instruction, or you can even go further and say, okay, instead of just saying, let's work on this task and use English in a practical way, let's go to another level and go right to the content. So content-based methods, I lump them in here, but I'm going to differentiate. It's important, right? So we have content-based language teaching, that's CBLT. We have content-based instruction, and we have CLIL, and CLIL, I totally always forget. I know it's, I'm gonna check my notes here, guys. I'm gonna cheat on this one because I always forget it. Yes, here we go. Content and language integrated learning. Content and language integrated learning. I'm fine explaining what CLIL is, but I'm always bad at remembering what the acronym is. So let's differentiate between them. So content-based language teaching, you probably don't hear about this a lot, and there's a good reason. This came out when things where the idea was, let's just not use, let's not only use authentic materials like realia, but here comes new media. Here comes, a podcast, for example. That's a good way to start. Let's use this podcast in our teaching. So communicative language teaching emphasized authentic materials. Content-based language teaching said, let's just only use like what's already out there. Forget textbooks, let's use this. Well, a lot of people do that now. Like basically CBLT is incorporated into almost any good language course, I believe, right? Content-based instruction is going further, right? So content-based instruction is like, okay, we're going to learn English using materials for other subjects. So we're going to go and use, economics texts or history texts, right? Depending on what the learner needs, right? It's not a history class. It's not an economics class. It's still language teaching, but we're going to use materials. We're going to basically go into another curriculum, bring in the materials from that curriculum and use them to teach English. And CLIL is the next step, which is often used in a bilingual program, right? It's what's different about CBI and CLIL is CBI is saying, okay, it's a language course. It's English as a second language, but we're going to use materials from another area. CLIL is saying, okay, no, we're just going to teach English while we are teaching this other subject. So instead of just bringing history materials into the language classroom, we're going to teach history and English together, right? So it's often in a bilingual situation. For all of these, teaching English through content and other subjects, the main idea here, right, is, hey, if you're interested in learning, if you need to, hopefully you're also interested in learning, biology, you want to be a biologist, then whether we bring in something like a biology podcast for content-based language teaching, or we just say, hey, we're going to use biology texts to learn English, or hey, you're going to learn biology in a CLIL program and learn English at the same time, right? Obviously, we can build more than just language skills when we are also learning other subjects. The biggest drawbacks here have to do with more practical situations, both with the teachers and the learners. So if you don't have the background, right? So maybe you think, okay, we really got these students who really need marketing English. So, we're going to teach them that, but then you have a teacher that doesn't really know that. They want to know it. Maybe they're interested, but they're not really, especially if you get into CBI and CLIL, if they don't have the skills, the background and the experience in those subject areas, then that could be a big problem, right? Either you can't find the people you need, or you put people in there that don't have the background experience and the skills. Same problem could be for students, right? So you might have some students that do have enough knowledge in the subject, and they're in a group with students who don't. That could become tricky for a teacher. But it's also tricky, right, with students who have different English abilities. So it's not necessarily a big problem if you are a teacher with experience teaching students with different English levels. You might also be a teacher that's experienced with teaching students with different levels of knowledge in the subject area. Moving on to the lexical approach, and I kind of went a little bit quickly with the others because just as I stopped and kind of talked about audiolingual and communicative language teaching, I also want to talk about the lexical approach and how it connects back to communicative language teaching and audiolingual. In a way, we can kind of look at, and you hear people talk about this, the approaches as sort of the audiolingual and the communicative language teaching, right? And we talked about the baby in the bathwater. And it makes sense in a way because, along the way, we have the direct method, we have natural approach, we have, task-based learning, but you can see, I think, how those connect back to certain things with audiolingual and certain things with communicative language teaching. Direct method, which came earlier, was a big deal, right? Because it really influenced what happened next, but it kind of seems primitive when we look at it now. So it's more like, wow, it really gave birth to these others, right? The lexical approach came along later, right? 80s, they were writing about it. 90s, it started to happen. When I got into language teaching in the late 90s, this is what I just latched onto, So I had the CELTA, communicative language teaching, all the way. But there was also a bit of the lexical approach in there, in the sense that it was focusing more on lexis over grammar. And at that time, there was more controlled practice and more repetition drills built in. So I just fell in love with language teaching with the CELTA in the 90s, and the masters I did, because I think at that time it was really bringing in all of the things that really language learners need. Not that there wasn't room for improvement, but I think later there was much more of a divergence, like, okay, communicative language teaching should be about production, not about learning patterns. Oh, but you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because audiolingual was helping you get those patterns. But what was missing from both of them was this. Neither of those methods or approaches, if you prefer, were thinking enough about the fact, it's not disputed, right, that language is not about grammar first. It's about vocabulary first, right? It's grammaticalized lexis, right? Language is lexis. And if you, even communicative language teaching, you could see focus on grammar more than it was really focusing on collocations, chunks of language. Audiolingual, great that it was doing pattern practice in these ways to make us more automatized language, but what was it using? Was it using high frequency chunks? What were you repeating? What were the drills? What was the content? So lexical approach was the most beautiful content. It was based on language corpora. What were people really saying? Communicative language teaching was trying to do this. Lexical approach says, forget about the grammar focus happening that was still happening. Let's not think about that. Just like direct method and natural approach, let's not talk about grammar explicitly. Let's focus on chunks of language, right? This is how we learn English or any other language, but we're just talking about English. We don't learn what the word take means. We learn take through chunks. Take my hand, right? That's physical. Take a break. Take a shower. Oh, are those idioms? We don't think of them as strange idioms. We just start to learn that take has, right? It's about polysemy, different, these verbs are delexicalized, right? They need other words. They need to chunk to be meaningful. That's how language is. Take it easy. Now we're getting more idiomatic. But this is how we learn naturally, through chunks, through collocations. Students often love this. They're like, ooh, I love, make and do. What are the collocations? What words go together? It's not about grammar and logic. It's just about how language works naturally. What could be possibly wrong with this? Well, the audiolingual method, remember, was all about exposure. Natural approach in some ways too. You need to get input, right? Well, of course it was, but did people get enough input? But the point is, right? Audiolingual is saying here, force feeding you input. Natural approach, like, hey, relax. Here's the input. But you need that input to produce, right? Communicative language teaching, in many cases, didn't do this, right? Especially sort of later on. But even the lexical approach, and this was where I had a problem with this. I loved it so much. And, this is perfect. But hang on a second. How are my learners going to get enough of these chunks to be able to use them when they speak and they write? So as I mentioned earlier, and Michael Lewis, who is the primary author, creator of this approach. Language consists of grammaticalized lexis, not lexicalized grammar. It's about chunks, about collocation. That's great. We're going to look at some collocations in a moment. Well, here they are. We mentioned make or do. How do you know it's do homework or make homework? My daughter, in a story I often share with students, when she was very little, said, "Dad, look, I'm making my homework." So I said, of course, like most parents would, "Oh, you're doing your homework." And what did she say? "I'm doing my homework. Look at me do my homework." Well, I did my homework. She repeated it. That's the natural way. So direct method, recognize that. Natural approach, right? Get that input, get exposure to it. That's how we learn. And Lexical approach says exactly, it needs to be in chunks. Don't think about why, just it comes in chunks. Well, that's great. So there are lists. Lexical approach had lists. Lexical approach had worksheets, make and do. Fill the gaps. Which one is correct? I tried this, but it wasn't until one day that I really realized the problem. So here I am helping students with chunks of language, right? Worksheets and games and things, right? Trying to get them to know which collocations are most important. And then one day, and I should say, I have to say, it wasn't working enough. Like students liked it. As I said, they were engaged, right? Okay, how can we bring in lexical approach? Here are these collocations. Can that help you with the target language for communicative language teaching? Yes. Okay, if you have these chunks, then you're going to do better in this communicative task. I wasn't doing task-based as much, but I was sort of doing the communicative language teaching scenarios, collocations. That was the key. But my students didn't always have them. Where was the automaticity from audiolingual? Why didn't they just pop out? Well, one day I said, I always, and I had a student say Coca-Cola. A student who usually didn't speak in class. But when I said always, they said Coca-Cola because at that time there was a commercial and a magazine ad and billboards on a bus, always Coca-Cola, always Coca-Cola. That was the chunk. My student, without thinking, when I said always, said Coca-Cola. It's the same way when I say hello, and students say, "It's me." Those are collocations. It chunked. But why did it come out so quickly like audiolingual wanted, right? That automaticity, being able to produce it without thinking. Exposure. My student had seen always Coca-Cola so many times and in a relaxed state. So shout out to Krashen, comprehensible input, and being relaxed, acquiring the language, not consciously thinking and trying to learn it. So I tested this. Just do it, my student says. Kentucky Fried Chicken. Aha! Here was the connection. Audiolingual, communicative language teaching, and the lexical approach, which is what I recommend you do as a teacher and what I see the best teachers doing. If you say, "But I like task-based learning," same thing. What can you learn from audiolingual? We need lots of repetition. What's wrong about that? What doesn't work? It's not meaningful. It's not in context. Who wants to repeat things like, I eat breakfast, you eat breakfast, she eats breakfast, right? Or just drills. We don't want to do that. Yet we need to have those forms ready to use, right? Where are the collocations? Audiolingual didn't have them. Communicative language teaching, well, they started to have them when lexical approach came in more than anything else, right? But the lexical approach failed because it didn't give us a solution to how to get all that exposure. If you do a worksheet on make and do flashcards, and also that can be boring, right? So some of you know what I do. I'll get to that in a moment. To make it so it's very easy. We know it's listen to music. Well, why? Because you hear and see listen to music enough times, but not through a drill, because who's going to do that and be motivated? But other ways that you're going to get enough exposure, enough input of these chunks, these collocations. Relaxed, engaged, motivated to get them. And this is how it relates to grammar. You probably say this is a grammar issue, right? But really, it's a chunk issue. I want it to go sounds correct because you've heard it and seen it so many times. Can't really explain it well from a grammar approach or even a logic approach. I enjoyed to go, no, sounds wrong, looks wrong. But here, if a student stops for a moment, like with make and do, and isn't sure, it's because of frequency. How common is this verb? So if you get enough exposure, I hesitated to do it. I hesitated to go there, right? It's going to sound right and look right. That's true for everything. So what's the point? Communicative, absolutely. But we need the repeated exposure. So communicative activities, absolutely. Relaxed. So let's look at this. Relaxed, natural approach. Actively engaged in communicative activities, communicative language teaching, task-based instruction. Repeated exposure to collocations. The repetition comes from audiolingual. But the collocations come from lexical support. Where are we getting those? Right? We don't have enough time in the classroom in a communicative activity to get them. Needs to come from where? Songs, TV series, memes, jokes, dialogues, right? Drama scenes, watching a scene from a series, right? Games, playing games where you get repetitive exposure to chunks, collocations. Then we can do what all of us want. Build on that foundation. So if you watch my webinars, if you see what I do, you'll not be surprised that here we are with Bloom's taxonomy, right? As I said, we want students to be here to apply, analyze, evaluate, create with language. How, both sound a little strange. However, is it possible to get students to think critically, to use higher order thinking skills in another language, even their first language, but let's talk in English, when they don't have a foundation? That foundation was what audiolingual was about. This is why I love audiolingual. They said, look, you're not going to get anywhere unless you have a foundation. Now, some critics would say audiolinguals didn't think about getting anywhere. Okay, fair enough. And communicative language teaching said, hey, audiolingual, all you care about is down here. Recall facts, memorize, repeat, just drill. But I don't think that was always true. I think some people said, look, if we don't do this, how are people going to get here? But at any rate, you also had people in communicative language teaching, people I respect a great deal, that wanted people here, and they recognized that there needed to be more input. The problem was it wasn't built into the approach so much. So when I say collo and spark, collocations, that's the lexical approach. Build that knowledge of English. Then you can really communicate. And we're back here now thinking about what we said earlier. Is it true that we just have a paradigm shift one to the next? I mean, grammar translation to what happened next, that's a pretty big shift, right? And, you know, direct method was there, but let's go into audiolingual. We're looking at communicative. Once you look at language for communication, audiolingual, maybe not enough writing and reading. Well, really not at all. That's something we didn't talk about, audiolingual. But anyway, the big shift happened when it was not about knowing the language just as a subject or just to translate things, but to use it every day, right? Everything after that is about, hey, let's communicate. So after that, was there a paradigm shift? I don't think so, which is good. It's not about, okay, audiolingual didn't work. Bye-bye. Now it's communicative language teaching didn't work. Task-based. Oh, task-based didn't work. Lexical approach. No, we are bringing in mixing and matching. However, are there teaching methods that are in wide use today? I think we can safely say communicative language teaching and task-based language teaching are the most used, and for good reason, because they incorporate, I think they best incorporate what the others did well when they do well, right? So, for example, a communicative language teaching classroom, if a student is getting enough exposure outside of the class, watching TV series, listening to songs, and this is how I use CLT, then when they come to class, we can do an activity, which is a very, very much a CLT activity, or we can do something that's more task-based. Both. We can do anything that's communicative, and the students are right there because they have enough grammar, vocabulary up here that can be used automatically. If the student's not getting enough exposure, not getting enough repetition, it's never going to work. Now, does that mean it should be drilling like audiolingual? Should we go back to rote learning? Absolutely not, in my opinion. But to think that you can achieve what you want to achieve with communicative language teaching and task-based language teaching, if the student doesn't have the language up here, not going to work. We need to be engaged. We need to have fun. We need to be getting repetition in a way that we enjoy. And if we do that, and we don't forget it, it's here, it's automatic. What we learn with pleasure, we never forget. I'm going to end things here on that note because, hey, what better note than that? Big up, American TESOL Institute. Thanks so much for allowing me the privilege, the pleasure of hosting these webinars. English teachers worldwide, wherever you are, whomever you teach, however much experience you have, thanks so much for joining us today live and watching asynchronously this recording. Please share it, get it out there, and explore, right? As I said earlier, of course, I'm not getting into these approaches, these methods in any deep sense, but you can. After listening to what I said, whether you agree with what I said, disagree with what I said, I hope it inspires you one way or the other to look more deeply into these methods and approaches. I wish you the very best in your teaching and everything else, and see you next time. Respect.